Please remain standing now as I read this morning's text. This is from Judges chapter 4. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now that Ehud was dead, I phrased that really poorly, didn't I? So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim, because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. They cried out to the Lord for help. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time, and she held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to Mount Tabor. And I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands." This is the word of the Lord.
God, you may be seated. To all the younger brothers in the room who have an older brother who beats on them, someday when you preach a sermon, you can make your brother read from Judges in front of a crowded room as well. Thanks, buddy. No problem. In 1995, it was April 19th, a man by the name of MacArthur Wheeler attempted one of the more unique bank robberies in all of human history. Convinced that it would prevent any CCTV cameras from seeing his face, he covered his face with lemon juice because lemon juice was commonly used as a form of invisible ink. And so he had lemon juice all over his face and walked in and attempted to rob a bank, even grinning at every camera that he saw. Well, as you might imagine, this did not work even remotely. And so after his apprehension, he was being interviewed by the police, and the moment of reckoning happened when he watched back the footage on the CCTV cameras, and just plain as day, he could see his own face, which left Wheeler utterly astonished. And he began to express his disbelief by repeating this phrase, "But I wore the juice. But I wore the juice." This outlandish episode involving MacArthur Wheeler has earned its place as a renowned case study in the realm of psychology, and it contributed to the unveiling of what's known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive bias wherein individuals with limited competence in a particular task tend to overestimate their abilities. If perhaps you're not picking up on the Dunning-Kruger effect, let me share with you just a short video. Kelly, you can go ahead and roll this video. This last spring, John's already cringing. A few friends of mine and myself, we got to go skiing. And so I pretty boldly followed some skiers who were much better than I was. Their names are John and Kenny and Vance. And so I was following them over to a very difficult section. It doesn't look that scary. This is really scary. I will not have you make fun of me after the service, okay? This is way more steep than it looks. It's the camera, okay? The fisheye lens, it's different. You don't get it, okay? And so behind me is Chad Cousins. And Chad and I are both what you would call intermediate skiers. We're not great, and we were following the really good skiers. And so I'm kind of making my way down, thinking, I've got this. I'm falling my way down, and you know who really doesn't got this is Chad Cousins, who just slid right past me. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect. A cognitive bias that leads one to believe that they have something under control that they really don't. And there's about 2 more minutes of this. So Kelly, we can cut it off there. The Dunning-Kruger effect. And this is actually a very helpful lens into Israel in the time of the Judges. See, there's this repeated refrain that once again another generation had grown up who did not know the Lord. This is what we see, this This Dunning-Kruger effect happening in the life cycle of an entire people group who have decided in their own minds and hearts that they no longer need the God who had just liberated them a few generations before. In this story of Judges, we see what is the common pattern. We begin with a dire situation. There is a void, there is a vacuum. Because Israel once again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. This pattern is perpetuated through their inattentiveness to the Lord and to how he had led past generations. And I am more than ever passionate about leadership. I think leadership matters more than it ever has. And I hope that as you've journeyed through Judges, you're seeing that this is not just things that have happened thousands of years ago in places far away. The story of God's people in the book of Judges is actually a great contemporary story for where we find ourselves culturally even now. And so as we think about ourselves as leaders, I hope you think about yourself as a leader. You need to consider this. Look at those you are leading. How are you planning the handoff that's required to ensure the success of future generations? In our text today, we have Judges 4, which tells the narrative account, and then Judges 5, which is known as the song of Deborah and Barak. And they will sing this song of victory, but it is also a retelling of all that God has done. And so we get the privilege of holding these two side by side and drawing some more details and clues from their song and putting those into the story. And one of the very first things that we notice in Judges 5:7 is this. Here's how they describe this moment in the lifespan of Israel. Judges 5, verse 7, they chose new gods, and so war came to the city gates. They chose new gods, and so war came to the city gates. War waits at the gates of those who worship lesser gods. Now, Judges is one of those parts in the Bible that's hard for us to wrap our minds around because we've overemphasized at this point this idea that God is love. He certainly is. But the number of passages in all of the Bible who say specifically that God is love is a total of 2. And they're both found in 1 John. Now, God most often describes himself as holy, set apart, other. We are like God in that we are made in his image, but God is not like us. And God demands holiness from his people. And so while we might see some of the things that happen to Israel as cruelty, it is actually God's great compassion. Because God will not allow people to continue in their sin. He will bring disruption to our lives when we find ourselves in error. And for many of us, those are in the form of natural consequences. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. We've done that. But God will do that to his people to remind them of their necessity for him. And it is the leader's job in any context, in any situation, to pass on the lessons that they've learned. And what happened in Israel is that these leaders who are supposed to link one generation to the next were not passing on these lessons learned. We're not instilling within this next generation what was of most importance. War waits at the gates of those who worship lesser gods, and Israel continued to go back to lesser gods. Now, what's natural is entropy. Entropy is this idea that everything is moving towards disorder, towards chaos. It is a natural part of our world and of human life. We are constantly moving toward disorder. And so we must interrupt those cycles. We must, as leaders, be disruptors, people who see where things are headed and insist that a different way is chosen. Entropy is natural. Drift will occur. Even things that begun with the most high of ideals have the propensity and probability to drift. In 1636 in New England, there was a pastoral training school that was founded with the sole intention of having only Christian educators to train up Christian pastors. Their stated mission was this: to be plainly instructed and consider well that the main end of your life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ. That university is known as Harvard. Harvard, who now proudly displays that they have a weekend called Incest Fest at one of their dorms. Harvard, who now has nothing to do with training up pastors for Christian ministry. Only 80 years after its genesis, in the year 1701, Harvard had many disgruntled leaders in their midst who decided it was time to part ways with what they had originally intended and begin a new pastoral training school. Funded by a man named John Mathers and centered on the life and teaching and leadership of a man named Elihu Yale. Yale University was founded. Drift occurred again. Drift will happen. Entropy is natural. It is the responsibility of a leader to see where things will head and disrupt them. Maybe you've heard this statement before. It's been popularized by a man named Michael Hoff in one of his novels. Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. And weak men create hard times. If you were to ask me where we are in that cyclical pattern today, I would say we are now in the weak men creating hard times position. We have not done well at leading. We have not done well at teaching the lessons that have been learned to the next generation, who must then take the baton and run the race. And there's a lot of hullabaloo about generations, and Dusty took some shots at millennials and Generation Z and whoever, okay? I'm not here to fight back. Here's what I would say. If you don't like what you see, look at yourself. The faults and failures of generations that exist today are not because they've only done foolish things. They are because the leaders who were supposed to instruct them have not done well in instructing them. Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. This is natural, and we must, as leaders, be disruptors. It was the oppression of Israel that ultimately led to their obedience. And so in this, we see that God is wise enough to let us feel the weight of our lives without him. But he is also gracious enough to rescue us from our foolishness. It is the oppression that forces correction. My son Porter loves to ride his bike, and he really loves to ride it without shoes on. And I hope every time he gets on his bike without shoes on that he scrapes the snot out of his toes so that he learns to put shoes on. Oppression forces correction, and your leadership matters. The lessons that you leave behind for generations that will follow you matter. How will you hand off to those who will learn how to lead from you after you? How you think about the handoff is of utmost importance. And when you do not prepare the person behind you, you have not led well enough. Now, too many of us in the room have already checked out and thought, I'm not a leader, so that doesn't apply to me. Nonsense. Everyone is leading someone. Everyone is responsible to lead someone. This is the pattern that Jesus insists upon. Discipleship is not a one and many, it is a one-to-one. And we must all take up the mantle of leadership to accomplish what Jesus has given us to accomplish. Next, we read about King Jabin, who was likely a dynastic ruler. We know this because of Joshua chapter 11. It lists another King Jabin, and so likely this was a family name. But Jabin fades into the background, and Sisera becomes the main antagonist of this story. Sisera is probably not a Canaanite. He was likely a gun for hire, a mercenary of sorts who was leading the army of King Jabin. And there are two very important pieces of information. The first is that he dwells in Harosheth Hagoyim. He was positioned in a specific, strategically advantageous place. But the second is this, and this is perhaps the most important part or important detail about Sisera. He has 900 chariots fitted with iron at his disposal. These are especially difficult for infantry. These iron chariots were not a technology that Israel possessed. And so they pose great intimidation to them. Contrary to what is commonly perceived or believed, chariots were not like tanks. This is not a sieging force, but chariots were often used in the pursuit and slaughter of an enemy. And so once you could get an enemy to turn around and retreat, then the chariots would chase after them and mow them down. And so even the thought of going to war against Sisera and his great army, even the thought of retreat was intimidating because of what would happen. These chariots were primarily a killing platform. And so Sisera was imposing and intimidating. We begin with a dire situation in which there's a void and a vacuum of leadership, in which the cycle that Israel finds themselves in frequently is perpetuated once again. But God will raise up devoted servants who serve as this voice for the way forward. In verses 4 and 5, we learn about these servants. We begin to learn about them. Deborah is listed as a judge. Here's what it says. Deborah, prophetess and the wife of Lapideth, was judging Israel at the time. She would sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites went up to settle their disputes. No other judge except for Samuel is also called a prophet, someone who dispenses revelation from God. And so Deborah's role is unique among all others that we find in this book of Judges. It was also different. The description of her leadership in Judges 4:5 reflects a role more like the judges appointed by Moses in Exodus 18. Moses links this function as a judge to divine revelation when he says the people are to come to him and inquire of God, and he tells them God's instruction. Deborah's role is also different and unique than other judges in that she never is specifically described as being raised up by Yahweh as a deliverer, something that's notable in the lives of people like Othniel, Shamgar, Ehud, Gideon, Samson, those others that are mentioned. The text does not say that the Spirit of Yahweh has come upon her as a saving of Israel, or the Hebrew Yashah. However, her role as a prophet and involvement in military strategy suggests that these descriptors probably broadly apply to her. What we should look at and lean into is this idea that essentially Deborah and this man named Barak, which we'll talk about in a minute, share the traditional role of judge, with Barak acting as the combat leader under the direction of Deborah. Now, the name Deborah, which you'll notice she got from sitting under a tree called Deborah, the Hebrew there means honeybee, which I really like because the role that we see Deborah playing in the story is not one of accomplisher but connector, one who hears from God and then goes and delivers information to someone else, just like a bee would pollinate from flower to flower. She's wise and resolute, she's bold, and she's full of faith. And there are only 2 women in the Bible that hold the title of prophetess, and she's one of them. Deborah leads from wisdom and character rather than might. She is very different than all the other judges, and she comes closest to being a truly godly leader than just a general. In this text, the ruler, Deborah, is not the rescuer, Barak, and the rescuer is not the ruler. There are 3 characters who all contribute to Israel's freedom from tyrannical reign. Neither Deborah or Barak will be the remover of an evil adversary. Deborah, Barak, and this woman named Jael play roles in redeeming Israel. Barak means lightning. And although it's unlikely, it is possible, and I'm actually tending to believe this. I'm not preaching this as fact. I'm tending to believe this. That you'll notice Deborah's husband's name is listed. Anyone remember what it was? I want to try to say it out loud. Lapideth. Lapideth, the Hebrew there meaning lightning. The Hebrew word Barak also means lightning or torch. And so while it's not necessarily a certainty, it is certainly a possibility that Barak was actually Deborah's husband under a different name. And so we are introduced to the character Barak, who Deborah approaches and begins to deliver this instruction from the Lord. Hasn't the Lord handed over the army of Sisera to you, is how she begins. And she will begin to lay out the battle plan. Here's what she says. Starting in verse 6, she summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "Hasn't the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you? Go deploy the troops on Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the Naphtalites and the Zebulunites. Then I will lure Sisera, commander of Jabin's armies, his chariots and his infantry at the Wadi Kishon, to fight against you, and I will hand him over to you." Now, for a lot of us, it's hard to pick up on the contextual clues, but let me just highlight a few places that will play a significant role in the story. The first is Mount Tabor. That God has given the instruction for Barak to rally the troops at Mount Tabor, which is near the river Kishon, the Wadi Kishon. There are two geographically important places that play into the strategy that Yahweh is delivering. And so this strategy is of utmost importance. Barak will respond, and here's what he will say. "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." She says to him, "I will gladly go with you, but you will receive no honor on the road you are about to take, because the Lord will sell Sisera to a woman." So Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh. 10,000 men followed him, and Deborah also went with him. Pause. Here's what often happens in this story. What happens as we try to see what's going on is we make a snap judgment. And in fact, lots of commentators do this as well. I read commentary this week that make this rush to judgment about this man named Barak. And what happens is most people see Deborah in her position as she is only the judge of Israel because men had abdicated all responsibility. That Deborah's only in this spot because there wasn't a qualified man to do it. And so then there's this frowning upon, there's this looking down upon this man named Barak, who we see in verse 8 says, "I will go with you if you will go." Like, I'll go do what God wants me to do as long as you go with me. And some people would interpret this as a statement of cowardice. That Barak is afraid and he will not accomplish the will that Yahweh has set out before him. But I don't read it that way. And there are a few reasons for that. And in fact, there are many other commentators who are beginning to see this differently, and Tim Keller foremost in all of them. And so here's what we should actually learn about Barak. That his response is not a sign of cowardice. His demand for Deborah to accompany him is not a lack of faith, but an insistence on the presence of God going with him. You'll remember this is why Israel has found themselves in trouble, is because of the Dunning-Kruger effect, a belief that they could do for themselves what only God was capable of doing. And so Barak is not dismissing Yahweh's instruction. He's insisting on the presence of Yahweh found in the person of Deborah to go with him into battle. How many of us see that as an unwise decision? No, we would all be wise to insist that Yahweh goes with us. And in this instance, Deborah was the presence of Yahweh among God's people. He is handpicked by Deborah. He has notoriety and acclaim. He has an ability to lead men into battle. And this was known, and it preceded the call. He was able to muster 10,000 men. That's no small feat. He was a man of influence and acclaim. He also recognizes Deborah as a mouthpiece for God. Rather than just dismissing her as a woman and rushing into an unwise battle, he listens to Deborah's instruction and follows her battle plan. And any man who could rally 10,000 other warriors to his name would no doubt have some pride in his ability to establish and execute his own plan. But Barak yields his way to Yahweh. He's a man who's able to receive instruction. That's noble. That's admirable. Like I mentioned before, he demands Deborah's presence, and in so doing, he's demanding the presence of Yahweh go into battle. This is not a war that he wanted to try to win on his own. And so Barak is to be commended by what he insists. He's making a plea for God's presence. He's a man who insists on God's presence going with him. He knows from the outset that the honor of victory will not be his. And while some people might interpret the statement from Deborah, you will receive no honor on the road you are about to take, as a prophetic kind of slight towards him, it's actually just a statement of fact. That he needs to know before he sets off into battle that the honor will not be his. How many of us will do the hard thing knowing that there's no honor to be had to our name once it's done? No matter how you stack it up, Barak was outmanned and outgunned. He didn't possess the fighting force that Sisera did, not to mention the 900 chariots. But he, in faith, charges down the mountain, 10,000 men in tow, into the teeth of a greater opponent. Barak leads with humility and understands there is nothing there for him to hold up publicly as an accomplishment. He's a man of integrity. He foreshadows another leader who did not consider equality with God something to be held on to, but rather made himself nothing, taking on the very nature of a servant. That's Philippians 2. It's a statement about Jesus. And if Barak was just a coward, then why do we have Hebrews 11, 32 and 33? This is where the author of Hebrews has been reminding all of the people about these great heroes of the faith. The Faith Hall of Fame, as this chapter is sometimes known, and person after person who God has brought up to help lead Israel is mentioned and applauded, and all of them have their points of failure and their faults, but all of them are commended for their faith. And so here's what the author of Hebrews says: "What more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies." If this character, Barak, was a coward, if he is one that we should look down upon, two things are happening. We are sliding Deborah, who God has certainly empowered and called to lead his people. We are also doing something that we shouldn't do to Barak, who is commended later in the Bible for his great faith. Barak will continue to pursue his enemy even without the promise of honor. And so here's how the text continues. Now Heber, the Kenite, had moved away, the sons of Hobab, Moses' father-in-law, and pitched his tent beside the oak tree of, this is tough, Zenanim, which was near Kadesh. Heber is one of those characters who's inserted in the middle of a story who seems inconsequential, like a random detail, but this is actually one of the more pivotal moments in all of the story. This is an important detail that we need to, with Mount Tabor and the Wadi Kashan, put in our pocket so that we can see the divine strategy at work as this culminates. It was reported to Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, and Sisera summoned all his 900 iron chariots and all the troops who were with him, from Harosheth of the nations to the Wadi Kashan. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Go, this is the day the Lord has handed Sisera over to you. Hasn't the Lord gone before you?" So Barak came down from the mountain with 10,000 men following him. And the Lord threw Sisera, all his charioteers, and all his army into a panic before Barak's assault. Sisera left his chariot and fled on foot. Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth of the nations, and the whole army of Sisera fell by the sword. Not a single man was left. The first crucial clue, which I mentioned earlier, was that of Heber's big move. Heber had moved from his people and had resettled in the land of the sons of Hobab. And so Heber's move positions him to be in a place where his wife Jael will be in a tent that will ultimately lead to Sisera's downfall. Heber, who was a Kenite, assumed to be a descendant of Cain, had relocated away from his people. And the most important piece here, we learn this from verse 17, was that he had made peace with King Jabin of Hazor, who was in charge of the army that Sisera was now leading. And so as Sisera flees the battle, his army now decimated, he's fleeing on foot. Here's what it says in verse 17. Meanwhile, Sisera had fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was peace between King Jabin of Hazor and the family of Heber the Kenite. Jael went out to greet Sisera and said to him, "Come in, my lord, come in. Don't be afraid." So he went into her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. And he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." She opened a container of milk and gave him a drink, which was custom, and covered him again. Then he said to her, "Stand at the entrance to the tent, and if a man comes and asks you, 'Is there a man here?' say no." Sisera hears that Barak had gathered his army to Mount Tabor, and subsequently routs his chariots and army to the Wadi Kishon, the river that the Lord had instructed. This is where the battle will take place. And this is where we see Deborah not being the accomplisher, but still being the pusher, and saying, "Hasn't the Lord handed over Sisera to you? Hasn't he gone before you?" Because there is to be no passivity in claiming victory. We glean from chapter 5, verse 4. Again, we hold chapters 4 and 5 right up next to each other, and we take the details from the song and inject them into the story. And here's what it says in chapter 5, verse 4. "The earth trembled, and the skies poured rain, and the clouds poured water." The text says that the Lord threw Sisera, all his charioteers, and all his army into a panic. That word panic, if we were to say it in the Hebrew, which I find really funny, we would pronounce it like you're puzzled or confused. That word in the Hebrew is the same word used in Exodus 14. As you'll remember, the chariots that set out from Egypt to pursue Israel, as they were crossing the Red Sea, God throws the army of the Egyptians into a panic. The very same word. This confusion falls upon them, and God begins to deliver the people of Israel by closing the waters around them. The scenes are startlingly similar. All artists have a signature. This is Yahweh's. And we can see this divine strategy take shape. The Lord had lured Sisera into a disadvantageous battleground. In all of his arrogance, he overbelieved in his own ability. The Dunning-Kruger effect. The water of the Kishon now rising from flash floods that we read about, and Barak screaming down the mountain with 10,000 warriors behind him, the water making the ground soft, the weight of the chariots forcing them to sink, no longer able to move and provide an advantage. And we know that these chariots were inoperable because Sisera abandons his. What was thought of as being his greatest advantage, God turns into his Achilles' heel. And we're reminded again of the nobility and integrity of Barak, who continues to pursue the enemy until they are all dispatched. Sisera's story continues as he, on foot, makes his way weary from battle into the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber. And now Heber's move to this location becomes a very important and crucial detail. Jael comes out to greet him, welcomes him into her tent, just as was custom to offer hospitality in that culture, especially to an ally. And so, Sisera's mind is at rest and is at ease, because Heber had peace with his king Jabin. To Sisera, Jael is not in the least intimidating, nor does she pose a threat. A woman? No, she must be scared of him. Jael's initial kindness places Sisera completely at ease. And here's what he says to her: "If a man comes, tell him there is no one in here." It is here that we have one of the most gruesome moments in all of the Bible, because Sisera falls asleep. And in chapter 4, verse 21, here's what the text says. "While he was sleeping from exhaustion, Heber's wife Jael took a tent peg, grabbed a hammer, and went silently to Sisera. She hammered the peg into his temple and drove it to the ground, and he died." The honor to a woman. Barak arrives, and Jael proudly shows off her victim. And it's funny, when he asks, "Is there anyone in your tent?" she's like, "Well, not really." but kind of. She takes Barak in, and there is Sisera, the foe of Israel, dead. So here's what we've seen in this story. A dire situation. A people consumed with sin. We see devoted servants, Deborah and Barak, and eventually Jael. We see a divine strategy, a victory that is only accomplished by God, a victory that can only be orchestrated by God, by moving people on the playing surface in order to be in a position to accomplish His will. Heber thought he was relocating based on his own interests, but it was actually according to God's. The battleground of Mount Tabor and the Wadi Kishon seemed to be inconsequential, but God knew what He was doing when He was devising the strategy to eliminate Sisera and his army. And Jael, this innocent woman who no one would have been intimidated by, becomes the ultimate victor in this story. Like Deborah, Jesus is the ruler unique among all others. Like Barak, Jesus does not seek honor for Himself. And like Jael, Jesus conquers the enemy despite His own appearance of humility. Jesus is all over the story, but here's what we must see. Beginning in chapter 6, right after our text is done today, it says this: "The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord handed them over to Midian 7 years." The cycle continues. As great a leaders as Deborah and Barak were, they did not hand off the lessons learned about the necessity to worship God. You only ever lead well with the Lord. And cycles are disrupted when leaders are devoted one generation to the next. We have to ignite fires of faith many times throughout our lives. If we are not feeding the fire will be bled dry. Entropy will happen. We will descend into disorder and chaos. It is a part of the way the world works. And with that knowledge in mind, how will we wage war against it? War waits at the gates of any of us who decide to worship lesser gods. And so as leaders, as parents, as coaches, as teachers, as elders, as members of our community, as bosses, and as whatever leadership position that you have, we must find it in ourselves to lead well into the next generation. Not to hold all the keys to ourselves, but to hand them off and to present sound instruction. Joshua, the leader of Israel, just prior to this text, is famously quoted often as saying, "Choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Leaders are needed. As we move towards communion, I want to just focus our minds on this one thought: decision. You have to choose. Leaders choose the right way, and they insist that everyone follows. If you're helping to serve communion, you can make your way to the back, and I want to read to you a quote from Charles Spurgeon that I can't let go of, and it comes from the very end of the book, the Titus 10, in which I want to invite all of our men to come be a part of that study. Since I've read this quote, I've shared it in numerous places with numerous groups of people because it will not let go of me. And so here's what Charles Spurgeon says: "It is today as it was in the Reformer's day. Decision is needed. Here is the day for the man. Where is the man for the day? We who have had the gospel passed to us by martyrs' hands dare not trifle with it, nor sit by and hear it denied by traitors who pretend to love it, but inwardly abhor every word. Look, you sires, there are ages to come. If the Lord does not speedily appear, there will come another generation and another. And all these generations will be tainted and injured if we are not faithful to God and His truth today. We have come to a turning point in the road. If we turn to the right, our children and our children's children will go that way. But if we turn to the left, generations yet unborn will curse our names for having been unfaithful to God and to His word." The world needs leaders more than ever. Leaders who have learned hard lessons and who will not let them go. Leaders who serve as links from one generation to the next. Parents who are so intentional with their children that they cannot escape your home without having the words of God written on their hearts. Parents who insist, who make it a priority that we practice our faith. We don't just talk about it. Bosses who lead with compassion and humility. Men who walk into the church building and don't say, "What's in this for me?" but rather ask this question, "What's in me for them?" Leaders will link one generation to the next. And cycles will perpetuate unless leaders are devoted to Jesus and Jesus alone. A dire situation, a devoted servant, and a divine strategy. We are forced to reconcile with this one decision. Is Jesus your leader? And if so, will you lead with him? Let me pray. Father, we trust this morning that your word has done the work. God, I see it over and over and over again. There's passivity, there's insecurity, there's doubt, and there are so many things that Satan has ruined in us. But God, just as your people did long ago, may we cry out to you. Finding ourselves oppressed by these enemies, God, would we insist on the way of worship, on this leader named Jesus, who would give his life for us, who was a devoted servant, who did not seek equality with you, but rather made himself nothing, and who led based on a divine strategy, not based on the impulses and encouragements of this world, who did what everyone thought was foolish and unnecessary by giving up his own life, dying on the cross. And so, God, today, may you find in us people of decision, leaders who are resolute, who insist on disrupting the cycle, and who will not perpetuate brokenness one more generation. Find that in us today as we find it in your Son. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.